On the morning of January 11th, 1944, a military transport touched down at the Boeing plant outside Wichita, Kansas, and General Henry Harley Arnold, commander of the United States Army Air Forces, the man charged with bombing Japan into submission, stepped onto the tarmac. He was 57 years old, already suffering from the heart disease that would eventually kill him, and he had come to Kansas with a single purpose. He needed bombers, not prototypes, not airframes on stands. Bombers that could fly, carry ordnance across 10,000 miles of ocean, and strike the Japanese home islands. He needed them by March 1, 1944, and he needed 175 of them. What he found inside the plant gave him reason for hope. The Boeing assembly floor stretched for more than 1.5 million square feet. Dozens of B-29 Superfortresses moved down the production lines in various stages of completion, the largest, most technically advanced bomber ever attempted in the history of aviation. Walking the floor with plant manager J. Earl Schaefer, Arnold located the 175th fuselage section and stopped. He pulled out a pen, signed his name to the metal, and looked at the men around him. "This is the plane I want," he said. "I want it before the 1st of March." No one told him the truth about what was waiting outside. On the delivery apron behind that plant, a concrete expanse covering more than 1.5 million square feet, sat 97 B-29 Superfortresses, 97 aircraft that Boeing had already built and delivered, 97 bombers that were supposed to be on their way to China and India to begin the strategic air campaign against Japan. And of those 97 planes, exactly 16 were flyable. The rest sat grounded, waiting for parts, waiting for repairs, waiting for modifications so extensive that the word modification barely covered it. Some of them had been parked there for 2 months without moving. The program that was supposed to end the Pacific War was frozen solid on the Kansas prairie, and the winter had barely started. This is the story of the Battle of Kansas, the most desperate industrial fight of the entire Second World War. It was not fought in the air. It was fought with wrenches and soldering irons and numb fingers in snowstorms, by men and women who worked until they collapsed, then got up and kept working. It was fought against the most complex machine America had ever attempted to mass produce, against a clock set by a promise the President of the United States had made to the government of China, and against a winter that seemed to have sided with Japan. The soldiers in this battle wore overalls. Their ammunition was rivets, and they won. To understand how bad it was in January 1944, you have to understand what the B-29 actually was. By any measure, the Superfortress was unlike anything the aviation world had produced. It had a pressurized crew cabin, the first production bomber in history to carry one, letting the crew operate at altitudes beyond most enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Its remote-controlled defensive armament used centralized fire control computers, allowing one gunner to aim multiple turrets simultaneously. 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines generated 2,200 horsepower each, driving 16-foot propellers. Its combat radius exceeded 600 miles. Fully loaded, it weighed around 140,000 pounds. No aircraft of its sophistication had ever been built, let alone produced on an assembly line at the pace war demanded. The problem was that America had tried to skip a step, and the step it tried to skip was time. Normally, a design of this complexity would have taken 5 years just to produce a working prototype. The Army Air Forces had 3. Engineering design, production tooling, and flight testing were happening simultaneously, each feeding changes back into the other. Change orders from Boeing's Seattle headquarters arrived at the Wichita plant so fast that workers sometimes completed an assembly only to be told the design had changed before they could start the next one. The first 100 B-29s were, in effect, handcrafted, each requiring an average of 157,000 man-hours. Each of those first planes had absorbed the equivalent of more than 80 men working for an entire year, and the engines were trying to kill people. The Wright R-3350 ran too hot. The rear cylinders, tucked deep in the engine nacelles with inadequate airflow, built up heat until exhaust valves failed and magnesium components caught fire. The problem had announced itself in the worst possible way on February 18, 1943, when the second XB-29 prototype, flying out of Boeing Field in Seattle, suffered an in-flight engine fire. The blaze spread before the crew could control it. The aircraft went down into a meat-packing plant just north of the field, killing all 10 men aboard and 20 workers on the ground. The crash had shaken the program to its foundations. Investigators found numerous problems with the engine's basic design. Engineers worked on fixes throughout 1943. None of them fully solved the problem. The B-29 would be flying into combat with engines that still ran dangerously hot, and everyone in the program knew it. By January 1944, all of this had converged into a crisis so serious it threatened to unravel American strategy in the Pacific. President Roosevelt had promised the Chinese government at the Cairo Conference in November 1943 that American B-29s would be bombing Japan from Chinese bases by the spring of 1944. That promise was the foundation of Operation Matterhorn. General Arnold had built his entire Pacific bombing campaign around it, creating the 20th Air Force specifically to operate the B-29 and reserving command of it for himself. An unprecedented move that told you everything about how much he believed the Superfortress would matter. And now the aircraft that was supposed to deliver on all of it sat in rows on a Kansas airfield, grounded by wiring faults, bad engines, distorting nose glass, wrong tires, undersized propellers, and 1,000 other failures. 97 planes built, 16 flyable. Arnold went home from Wichita in January still believing, or at least hoping, that his deadline would be met. 2 months later, he came back. What he found in March 1944 made him furious. Not one B-29 was combat ready. Parts were backlogged. The Boeing-run modification organization had collapsed under the strain. Some aircraft had sat in the same spot for months, waiting for parts that hadn't arrived, worked on intermittently by crews who had run out of the specialized knowledge the job required. Arnold's program, the one he had staked his professional reputation and the Pacific War's timetable on, was failing in a field in Kansas while Japanese steel mills ran undisturbed. He issued an order, April 15, 1944. Every targeted B-29 combat ready and on its way to India and China. That was the new deadline, and it was absolute. Then he handed the problem to Brigadier General Bennett Myers and told him to solve it by any means necessary. What followed was one of the most extraordinary industrial mobilizations of the entire war, compressed into 6 weeks on the Kansas plains. Myers acted immediately. 600 workers were pulled directly from the Wichita assembly lines, men and women who were building new B-29s, and redirected to the modification work. It was a deliberate trade. Slow the production of new planes in order to make the ones already built, actually, usable. From across the country, 200 specialist technicians were called in and told to converge on Kansas. Subcontractors were notified that all work on non-B-29 components was to stop until their B-29 commitments were met. The entire industrial apparatus was pointed at a single problem, and then they went to work in the middle of a Kansas winter. The modification centers did not have enough hangar space for the aircraft. The work had to happen outside, on the open tarmac, in weather that regularly drove the thermometer below zero. It was so cold that workers could only stay at a job for 20 minutes at a stretch before their hands went numb and they had to rotate inside to warm up. The tasks they were doing required precision, fine, careful, delicate work on some of the most sophisticated aircraft systems ever built. They did that work in blizzards, with numb fingers, under floodlights, around the clock. The scope of what had to be done on each aircraft was staggering. Every wing had to have its outer skin panels removed so engineers could add structural reinforcements, the beef-ups, and then each piece of aluminum skin riveted back into place. Every engine had to be pulled from its nacelle and rebuilt. The R335-23 war engines modified to R335-23A standard, with improved cooling and revised exhaust systems to reduce the fire risk that had killed men in Seattle. The cowl flaps, which controlled airflow around the engines, were redesigned and replaced. The plexiglass nose panels, 75 aircraft needed them, had to be removed entirely and replaced with distortion-free panes. The pressurization systems were rechecked on every plane. And then there were the electrical connections. Each completed B-29 contained 586 00 electrical connections, 586,000 individual wire joints that had to be removed from their plugs, disassembled, and resoldered by hand. Everyone in the cold. This was not a figure that included aircraft still on the assembly lines or wiring bundles waiting for installation. This was 586 zeros and connections per finished airplane, each of which had to be touched by human hands with a soldering iron before the aircraft could be trusted in combat. The crews working the electrical systems moved through the planes connection by connection, hour by hour, in temperatures that should have made the work impossible. They didn't stop. Lead men and foremen worked consecutive shifts, sometimes 3 days without meaningful sleep. 80-hour weeks were not an exception. They were the pace. Workers who built the planes on the day shift stayed through the night to modify them. The plant cafeteria served 15 0-cent hot meals a day because people needed to eat somewhere between shifts. The line between working and not working had ceased to exist. The phrase arsenal of democracy conjures assembly lines and staggering output. What it sometimes misses is the human reality underneath. The particular cold of a Kansas winter at 3 in the morning, the particular exhaustion of a worker who has been resoldering connections for 12 hours with 400 more to go, the particular stubbornness required to keep working when the job feels infinite and the deadline feels impossible. That was the Battle of Kansas, April 15, 1944. The deadline Arnold had set. 150 B-29 Superfortresses were certified combat ready. They turned east across the field, lifted off the Kansas runway, and began the 11,500-mile journey to India and China. The battle was over. The bombers were going to war. By May 8, 130 of them had made the crossing. The logistics ahead were brutal. To fuel a single bombing mission from the forward Chinese bases, B-29s had to make 7 supply runs over the Himalayas before the 8th trip carried bombs. The route was called the Hump. High altitude, savage weather, and the same engine problems that had plagued the program from the beginning. The B-29s made that crossing anyway, and made it again. On June 15, 1944, 47 B-29 Superfortresses lifted off from airfields near Chengdu, China, climbed into the sky, and flew north toward Japan. Their target was the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata, on the northern tip of Kyushu. It was the first time American aircraft had struck the Japanese home islands since the Doolittle raid of April 1942, 2 years during which Japan had been untouched and had perhaps begun to believe it would remain so. The bombs fell on Yawata in the early morning hours of June 16, Japanese time. Every one of those aircraft had been built in Wichita. The war did not end quickly after Yawata. The raid did limited physical damage, and the China-based operations were logistically strangling. But something had shifted. Japan's civilian population learned that their home islands were not beyond reach. And back in Wichita, the lessons of the Battle of Kansas were already transforming the production line. The number that captures what happened next is this. The first 100 B-29s off the Wichita line required an average of 157,000 man-hours each. By 1945, that figure had fallen to 17,000. The same aircraft, the factory, 1/9 the labor. Workers who had learned the plane inside and out, who had resolved 5 and 86, 00 electrical connections per aircraft until they could do it in their sleep, had internalized the machine so thoroughly that what had once taken a year of concentrated labor now took weeks. By early 1945, Boeing Wichita was producing 100 B-29s a month. The plant earned 5 consecutive Army-Navy E awards for production excellence, the highest recognition American industry could receive during the war. On August 29, 1945, with Japan's surrender already signed, General Arnold flew to Wichita one more time. He stood before the workers of the Boeing plant and said what he had come to say. "I recall very well my last visit here on January 11, he told them. I then told you people of Wichita and Kansas that we desperately needed additional planes of the range and striking power of the B-29, and because of the widely extended Japanese defense perimeter. Only if we had them could we knock the Japs out of the war without a costly series of land invasions." He was looking at the people who had done it, the people who had worked through the cold, through the blizzards, through the impossible backlog of connections and engines and nose glass and rivet lines. The people who had won a battle that never appeared in a dispatch, never made the front page, never produced a medal ceremony. The Battle of Kansas was over before the combat missions began, and it was fought by people whose names history has mostly lost. The lead men who slept in chairs, the women who resoldered wire by wire in frozen hangars, the technicians who drove through snowstorms to get to a shift they weren't required to take. The B-29 Superfortress would go on. It moved to the Marianas, where supply lines were short and runways were solid. It flew under Curtis LeMay, who stripped out the guns, loaded it with incendiaries, and sent it low over Japanese cities at night. It burned Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya. And it carried, in the end, 2 weapons that ended the war, the Enola Gay and Boxcar, modified B-29s that changed the world in an instant. But before any of that was possible, somebody had to fix the planes. Somebody had to go out onto a frozen tarmac in January 1944 and stay there until the job was done. The Pacific War was not won only in the air. A part of it was won in Kansas on the ground by ordinary Americans who decided that freezing was not a good enough reason to stop.